Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today for this very important panel, Facebook Exposure and What It Means to Latinx. I'm Brenda Victoria Castillo, President and CEO of the National Hispanic Media Coalition. For those of you who do not know NHMC, we are a 35-year-old civil rights organization that was founded to eliminate hate, discrimination, and racism towards Latinos. From the airwaves, video platforms, to social media, the majority of our policy portfolio has been focused on eliminating online disinformation and hate. This week, we witnessed a CBS 60-minute interview with former Facebook product manager, Frances Haugen. The next day, Facebook and its subsidiaries were down. Also this week, there was the Senate Subcommittee on Consumer Protection, Product Safety, and Data Security hearing, where the courageous Ms. Haugen testified. For those of you who do not get a chance to watch the hearing, we have gathered some clips together that we will watch now.
And big tech now faces that big tobacco jaw-dropping moment of truth. It is documented proof that Facebook knows its products can be addictive and toxic to children. And it's not just that they made money, again, it's that they valued their profit more than the pain that they cause to children and their families.
And here you go, 66% of teen girls on Instagram and 40% of teen boys experience negative social comparisons. This is Facebook's research. 52% of teen girls who experienced negative social comparison on Instagram said it was caused by images related to beauty. Facebook calls, conveniently, problematic use is most severe in teens, peaking at age 14. Here's what else we know. Facebook is not interested in making significant changes to improve kids' safety on their platforms, at least not when that would result in losing eyeballs on posts or decreasing their ad revenue.
A pattern of behavior that I saw at Facebook was that often problems were so understaffed that there was kind of an implicit discouragement from having better detection systems. So for example, I worked, my last team at Facebook was on the counter-espionage team within the threat intelligence org. And at any given time, our team could only handle a third of the cases that we knew about. Okay. We knew that if we built even a basic detector, we would likely have many more cases.
Here, Senator Lujan and I also have pointed out the issue with content moderators. Does Facebook have enough content moderations for content in Spanish and other languages besides English?
One of the things that was disclosed, we have documentation that shows how much operational investment there was by different languages, and it showed a consistent pattern of underinvestment in languages that are not English. I am deeply concerned about Facebook's ability to operate in a safe way in languages beyond maybe the top 20 in the world. Based on what I saw in terms of allocation of integrity spending, so one of the things disclosed in the Wall Street Journal was that I believe it's like 87% of all the misinformation spending is spent on English, but only about like 9% of the users are English speakers. It seems that Facebook invests more in users who make them more money, even though the danger may not be evenly distributed based on profitability.
Facebook exposed. Profiting on hate and disinformation is sickening. It's really just evil. The reason we are here today is because the needs of the Latinx community are more often than not overlooked by social media platforms, traditional news and media, and policymakers. The negative harm these social media platforms cause to our youth within the Latinx community is one of the most relevant issues we must focus on. Ms. Haugen's testimony exposed how Facebook allows disinformation and hate speech to thrive on their platform and encourages engagement and profits over public safety. However, the exposure of Spanish language and other non-English disinformation and hate speech content is more troubling, given the lack of content moderation and operational investment to moderate these type of content in languages other than English. According to Facebook's own market research data, more than 70% of all Latinos who use social media prefer Facebook over the other online platforms. Facebook's consistent pattern to underinvest in non-English language content moderation is deeply concerning. This blatant discrimination of the Latinx community who is the largest demographic group on the platform is completely unacceptable, and change must occur now. Today's ammunition is disinformation, and it is being used to silence our voice. For our health, for our safety, as well as for our fundamental rights, we must fight back against these harmful practices and hold these platforms accountable. That is why we are here today with our distinguished guests to discuss how to make Facebook accountable and push for significant policy changes. Let me begin by introducing Jessica Gonzalez, co-CEO, Free Press. Heidi Byrick, co-founder and chief strategy officer, Global Project Against Hate. Eileen Hershenoff, senior vice president of policy, Anti-Defamation League. Jacobo Licona, disinformation researchers with X Labs, and Claudia Ruiz, civil rights analyst, Unidos US. Thank you again for making yourselves available for this very important discussion. I would like to start off with the panel by asking everybody, what was your first impressions of how Ms. Haugen's testimony? Let me begin with Jessica, Heidi, and then just so on and so on. Jessica?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think Ms. Haugen is an incredibly credible witness. She brought tens of thousands of pages of documents to back up her observations about her time at Facebook. I found her revelations to be very accurate and in line with things that I have observed about Facebook in my time tracking them. Listen, what's surprising about this isn't that Facebook systematically profits from hate, lies, violence, conspiracy theories, and white supremacy. That much we already knew. What was surprising and shocking and frankly unacceptable about what we found out this week is that Facebook has actual knowledge that it is profiting off of these things, has made active choices not to take the efforts necessary to curb hate and lies, and has participated in a serial cover-up of its harms on a global basis. And this is what shows us that Facebook is unfit to govern itself. We need government regulation. We need also Facebook to step up and take some accountability. And that is not what we're seeing this week. Instead, what we're seeing is Mark Zuckerberg on a sailing trip during the testimony. We're seeing a statement after statement from Facebook saying, nothing to see here, folks, trying to undermine this woman who came forward at great personal risk. So we're not seeing the kind of accountability that we need to see from this global capitalist system. And we're not seeing, we're just not seeing the kind of response we ought to expect as people who Facebook profits off. And so I guess the last thing I'd say is like, I want to be really clear how Facebook makes money. It's by selling advertising to us. And the way that it sells, the way that it procures money from advertisers is by cataloging the number of people that are on the platform, by collecting our personal information, both demographic data, our immigration status, our age, our income, our just race, ethnicity, home ownership status, down the line, who we interact with, what we say, what we do on the platform and off. And then it targets us based on what they perceive to be our vulnerabilities, based off this extraction of our data. So when I say Facebook owes us better, I mean that because it's directly profiting off of us. And this week I've been completely disappointed by the reaction from the company. I think they owe our community more. I think they owe folks in general across the globe more. And now I've gone on and on, so I'll hand it back to you, Brenda, or off to Heidi.
Heidi. Mhm.
Well, first of all, thank you, Brenda, for putting on this important event. This is, absolutely critical. And I mean, I second everything that Jessica said about what we've discovered. And, I think Frances Haugen's, she was an incredibly credible person. She had command of extensive amount of facts. Of course, if you take the time to read through the SEC the documentation she gave to the SEC, you see everything backed up, one fact after another. What I thought watching the disclosures this week was that, the civil rights community, organizations like those represented here today, Jessica and I co-chair something called Change the Terms, which has 60 civil rights organizations in it and deals with tech accountability. I was just astounded at the fact that so many of us, everybody on this call, for so long have been saying to the world and saying to Facebook, these problems exist on your platform. You have to do something about it. There are real world harms from hate and disinformation. People are suffering. In some cases, there's genocides happening. People are being killed, right? It's astounding. And what we've gotten back over the years are just so many lies, so many obfuscations, such a lack of responsibility to something that is so devastating to people. It's the nonchalance and the lack of care from the leadership over at Facebook is to me just, it's inhumane. It's deeply shocking. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg's latest post on Facebook is of some robot crawling across this, I don't even know how to describe it, some robotic mechanism. And what we're talking about are people dying, people being exploited, people being discriminated against. The disconnect is just, I don't understand the blasé attitude. But I want to say that the civil rights community has actually documented most of this. We just hadn't seen. We've done tons of research, so many organizations, to figure out all these things that Frances Haugen talked about. We just didn't have the inside look. And the fact of the matter is, as we have all been lobbying and pointing out to Facebook about all these problems, they have known from their own research that all of this was going on. And to the public, they presented this face like, we're taking care of this, we're handling it. Hate has no place on our platform. And it's just so deeply cynical and disturbing. I mean, really. And the use of data that Jessica was describing, the depth of that to market to us, I mean, it's creepy, right? It's really creepy and really scary and really dangerous. So I want to thank Frances Haugen for coming forward and documenting all of this, and other whistleblowers. Sophie Zhang, for example, who came out a little while ago, showed us how Facebook was just letting down people all throughout the global South, just brutally, allowing elections to be manipulated, just terrible things. So that's sort of my sum up of how I felt about all this week.
Yeah, they're very courageous. And about the research, Heidi, it's not that civil rights organizations, we've been asking for this information, but they refuse to give us the data. Eileen?
Thank you. And I so agree with both Jessica and Heidi. I mean, I was deeply angered, but not surprised by what Frances Haugen said. And I suspect that this is the tip of the iceberg. I just want to mention again the respect I have and how much I appreciate the courage it took for her to come forward against this $1 trillion company that has really, crushed a lot of opposition. And I hope others will follow her lead. I had three main takeaways. First, as Jessica and Heidi said, her testimony provides additional and devastating evidence of what was already apparent to us, that Facebook has not been truthful, nor have they taken the necessary steps to address hate, extremism, and discrimination, and that makes them complicit at best. They have misled the public, Congress, including under oath, users, advertisers, shareholders, and their own board, and in many cases, their employees. It's proof that you can't trust Facebook's claims about its content moderation, and it's long past the time when anyone could possibly believe that self-regulation can work. For example, Facebook has consistently boasted that it detects and removes a huge majority of hate speech on its platforms. But now Haugen shows via internal documents that it's really only 3 to 5% of hate content and only 0.6, less than 1% of content invoking violence and incitement, including very much so the Latinx community. My second takeaway is she explained how this $1 trillion company developed algorithms that rank content by engagement, which ends up meaning that they amplify divisive, polarizing, hateful content far more than other types of content. And that is one major reason why we see a surge of extremism and hate and the erosion of trust in democracy and democratic processes like fair elections and voting rights. My third takeaway is that Facebook cannot be trusted to self-regulate or self-report, and Congress and executive agencies, as well as states, and those of us here with our own organizations, both individually and in coalition, have to take action. Thanks.
Claudia?
Yeah, so again, I thanks again for having this discussion, Brenda. I think it's incredibly timely and important. And I fear that this is going to be a conversation in which all of the panelists really tend to echo each other. And I think it is in that spirit that, you know, I wasn't necessarily surprised by any of Ms. Haugen's testimony. I think that our organization, in addition to those here, have been privy to the sort of open secret that is Facebook's willingness to act in bad faith, not only with respect to its user base and consumer base, but even when it comes to policy and lawmakers and civil society writ large. What I will say is that I think there were two surprising outcomes from that testimony. The first is, as Jessica mentioned, the response from Facebook, and in particular its leadership. I think it's really truly astounding the extent to which the organization is willing to go to really secure its bottom line. And that means partaking in a number of unethical actions. Again, going from lying directly to members of Congress, refusing to answer written inquiries from members of Congress and civil society, and even kicking off researchers that they had previously given access to in order to further shroud their internal processes and kind of aid in burying the evidence that did eventually come out with Ms. Haugen's testimony. I think there is one other surprising fact around the testimony that I think is one that's positive, and that is sort of the galvanizing moment that this has created with the general public. Again, I think all of us here on this panel have sounded the alarm around the harms associated with this platform for some time. And I think now is actually the time where the public has sort of woken up and really appreciated the damage that this platform does. And not only is that the platform engages in damaging practices, but it also profits in that and relishes in the fact that it profits immensely from that. So again, I think that if anything, this is definitely a watershed moment and time to actually take actionable steps in changing and fixing the ways in which these platforms operate. And having this conversation is a large part of that. So really grateful to be here.
Jacobo?
Yeah, thank you, Brenda, for having this important conversation. I couldn't agree more with what everyone else has said so far. I think Haugen's testimony was incredibly important. I think many of us who work in the space, and like what everyone else has said so far, like we're not necessarily surprised by the revelations, but mainly because we knew Facebook was causing harm and allowing disinformation to flourish on their platform. But again, part of the reason why her testimony, as well as her interview with 60 Minutes and some of the articles that have been published over the last couple of weeks, due to the information that she had, is essentially the credibility and the proof of what we already knew, just like the internal documents and the research to show proof of what is actually happening. And I think we now have confirmation that Facebook has known full well their platform is harmful, and them knowing this hasn't necessarily stopped them from amplifying harmful content to maximize their profit. And then to make it worse, as others have said, they're lying about essentially what they know. They hide information from the public, from the US government, and from other governments around the world as well. I think when it specifically to the Latinx community, we also learned some pretty important things that we had some knowledge about, but some pretty key statistics I think that are important. That Facebook is underinvesting in content moderation in Spanish. Haugen specifically said that they had a consistent pattern of underinvestment in languages that are not English, and that 87% of all the misinformation spending is spent on English, but only 9% of the users are English speakers. So there's a clear gap here where they're not investing enough to moderate the content in Spanish and other languages. Overall, I would just echo what everyone else said, that her testimony is, I think, one of many steps to finally hold the platforms accountable for their actions. There appears to be a lot of bipartisan support to hold them accountable. So it's important for Congress and the administration to take the appropriate actions now and demand not only answers from these platforms, but also more regulation.
So let's stay on the subject matter Jacobo just brought up on Spanish language. What is the danger when content moderation and operational investment doesn't apply to languages other than English? And I'm specifically speaking about Spanish language disinformation that targets the Latino community. Just jump in.
Do you want to kick us off, Jacobo? Because I know you've done a lot of research on this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's extremely dangerous. I think we saw actually yesterday an NBC News story actually came out citing a Nielsen report that said Latino audiences are more likely to receive and share fake news and misinformation online compared to the general population. And this actually tracks with a lot of what we have seen. From our research, we have shown that Facebook is worse at labeling or taking down Spanish misinformation, with less moderation, and harmful posts are left up longer. So for example, Facebook still has Spanish language posts as old as from November 2020 that promote election lies, and they're still active today with no warning labels. More recently, we've seen that Facebook will quickly flag vaccine misinformation content in English, but the same content in Spanish will take days to get flagged after many users have already seen the content. So obviously this type of moderation is not okay. There have also been reports about Facebook allowing pages and groups in Spanish with human smugglers advertising their services and targeting desperate migrants and refugees. So the lack of investment and content moderation is a real world problem that is directly impacting the Latinx community. Back to what Haugen's testimony said, she specifically said that she thought she knew how bad misinformation was, but then learned what it was doing in countries that don't speak English, which I couldn't agree more. As bad as these problems are in English, I believe they're much more problematic in Spanish and the impact it has on the Latinx community.
Hey, listen, I feel Latinos are under attack in this country, and disinformation is the weapon that's being used. They have tried to dehumanize us. They want to stop us from voting. They want to take our power away, and they want to silence us. And the ultimate is kill us. And I'm not being dramatic here. Everyone knows that more than 2 years ago, our community was massacred in El Paso in a Walmart. White supremacists drove over 600 miles across Texas, specifically wanting to get rid of the Hispanic invasion. And that was because Facebook allowed Trump to take out over 2,000 ads, fearing people about the border invasion. Our community is under attack, and we're not being dramatic when we say they're trying to kill us. They have killed us. Anyone else want to jump in?
I mean, I think you're right, Brenda. And what you're noting here is sort of a two-pronged attack. One is in English. One is in English, targeting our community with hate, allowing white supremacists whose literal goal is white ethno-states to wipe us out, to send us back to Mexico. That's like the majority of the hate calls I get still. Go back to Mexico. That they're literally trying to wipe us out. And they're letting, white supremacist groups. Facebook has helped further their goals by not just continuing to amplify those narratives like we've long had on radio and TV, but to target those narratives to young white men and folks who might be predisposed based on their demographic data that Facebook is collecting on them to those stories. And so there's an attack in English, allowing the proliferation of Donald Trump's ads is just one example. But there's also an attack in Spanish because of the underinvestment, as Jacobo has done a ton of research on. The underinvestment means that far more disinformation gets through in Spanish than in English. And let's just be honest, they haven't figured out the English language disinformation either, but it's much worse in Spanish. In addition to Jacobo's research, Avaz came out with studies last year about just how much false information about the election was getting through, and it was like 40% more election lies were getting through in Spanish than in English. And so there's no mistake about the purpose of this. It's to disenfranchise Latinx voters. It's to make us go away and not have our voices and our opinions and our desires heard in this democracy. So there's an authoritarian, anti-democratic aspect here that Facebook is a part of. It's deeply wrapped into their business model. The fact that they are not investing in Spanish language moderation is completely unacceptable. Here in California, where they're headquartered, 1 in 4 of us speak Spanish. So it's not like they weren't on notice that like people speak Spanish on Facebook, okay? We have the data now that Ms. Haugen revealed. And you know, Brenda, this is really making me think of how they responded to us when we worked on the Ya Basta Facebook campaign. So NHMC and Free Press and the Center for American Progress worked with some folks in the Change the Term Coalition. And we had some research of just like a number of examples where content in English that was either promoting violence or militia groups or hate or disinformation, in English it had been taken down, and almost identical content had been left up in Spanish. And we gave all these examples to Facebook. This was what, over a year ago now? And they were just kind of like, okay, we'll get back to you, like, talk to you later, you know? And then we realized they were just going to string us along and not really give us adequate responses. And so we made a concrete set of demands. Who's in charge of Spanish language moderation? How many content moderators do you have in Spanish? Are they native speakers? Where do they live? What are the kind of training materials that they have? And they have absolutely refused to answer any of those questions. And now we know why. Because the answer is embarrassing and unacceptable. They haven't invested in Spanish language moderation, even though it's a major world language. And they were hiding the facts from not just us, but from Congress. I mean, when you played that clip of Senator Klobuchar referring to the letter that she and Senator Lujan sent, they sent just this summer, they sent a letter asking these same questions of Facebook. And Facebook's response was downright disrespectful. They did not answer the question, even when US senators were asking.
Yeah, if I can jump in and really just quickly add, you know, what Jessica is talking about, all the different ways in which, you know, this has played out and impacted the Latino community in particular. You know, I think the disparities and the figures that Haugen's testimony cited in investment in language other than English content moderation, you know, there's no other way to interpret these choices than a clear demonstration and reflection of institutional discrimination and racism. There is absolutely the gap that exists between English language content moderation and other languages. There's absolutely no explanation for that gap other than the sheer bald fact of institutional discrimination. And I think that that's something that's really important and adds to the sort of outrage that the Latino community should really feel about all of this, is the fact that, you know, we're saying this again and again. It's not only that they knowingly divert resources away from protecting its users, but it's the fact that they even are willing to do it in a way that even exploits our community's vulnerabilities. And really fuels into other ways in which we have been historically marginalized and disenfranchised, and really kind of adopting the same sort of practices that we have long faced and lived with.
One of the problems is that Mark Zuckerberg does not report to anybody. He is the president and CEO of Facebook, who reports to the board. He's the chairman of the board, who really reports to stockholders. He owns the majority of the stock. So he has monopolized. He's a growing monster. He doesn't have to report to anyone. And I have to tell you, Jessica, you mentioned that Facebook is located in Northern California. California is made up 40% Latinos, more than 40%. Yet they do not have not even one board of director that's Latinx. And we have met with them and asked for them to reflect California. And they have refused to appoint a Latino on their board of directors. And I think that is done purposely. I think it's discrimination. Eileen, I think you were going to add something.
Yes, but I did want to just say one thing that you just mentioned, Brenda, I think is absolutely key about the governance and the monster. When they did their IPO, Mark Zuckerberg did something that's not unprecedented, but almost. I mean, he kept well over 50% of the voting shares because of the way they structured those shares. That's more than, say, Rupert Murdoch has at Fox, so that his daughter-in-law even recently just put out a scathing article about that. When you have that, you're not accountable to your stockholders and investors. You're not accountable to anybody. And that is something that is monstrous and is a real problem. But I wanted to go back to things you and Jacobo and Jessica and Claudia said about the Latinx, the context in which what's happening on Facebook is happening. You know, you sort of set the table. So ADL recently, last year, found out that over 30% of Hispanic and Latinx respondents in a nationally representative survey on online hate and harassment were harassed. And of those, 20% get severe harassment. I mean, that's threats of either doxing or threats of physical harm, sexual harassment, these kind of things. That's huge. And then if you look at according to the FBI's hate crime report that came out a couple of months ago, or less than a couple of months ago, anti-Hispanic hate crimes were the second highest of any identity group in a decade. And so they're the only other group that has more targeted in hate crimes, according to the FBI, are Black and African Americans. And that data we know is wildly underreported because so many huge cities don't report at all, or not credibly report zero hate crimes. And as you mentioned, then immigration and voting has become ugly weaponized issues designed to polarize us. So I think that when you look at conspiracy theories that are particularly dangerous and often targeted at the Latinx community, we're looking at that misinformation regarding COVID. Think of what's been said about immigration, and particularly on the southern border and from Latin America and COVID and the elections and immigrants' rights. And I want to say something since you mentioned a little over 2 years ago, the El Paso massacre, and that the perpetrator, his motivation, he was a white supremacist who believed in the great replacement theory, the belief that white Americans are being replaced by non-white immigrants, with the result being the extinction of the white race in the United States. And in his manifesto, he wrote, "Hispanics will take control of the local and state government of my beloved Texas, changing policy to suit their needs. They will turn Texas into an instrument of political coup, which will hasten the destruction of our country." And this white supremacist theory is foundational. It's one of the foundational theories in extremist rhetoric today. And one of the things that Facebook is aiding is that it is becoming mainstreamed and normalized. There's always going to be these white supremacists and replacement theory, but they were fringe. And now it's like a 24/7 Klan and white supremacists rally in not just fringe places on the web, but more and more normal. And it goes through so much of these white supremacist violent extremists. So for example, in the Pittsburgh Tree of Life massacre of Jewish worshipers, that was carried out by white supremacists who was blaming Jews for non-white Latinx and Hispanic immigration replacing a white Christian-dominated nation. So those are the conspiracies that are now becoming normalized and mainstreamed through platforms like Facebook and the algorithms that promote them.
So thank you, Eileen. Given all the revelations at the hearing that placed a spotlight on Facebook's willful neglect of hate speech, disinformation, and other harmful content, as well as omissions and falsehoods by their executives, including Mark Zuckerberg, to members of Congress and to advocacy groups like our own, I want to ask the panel, from an advocacy group standpoint, what policy reforms do you recommend? What are some of the solutions? You know, what we can do immediately versus long-term solutions? Jessica?
Sure, I'll hop in there, and then I see Heidi was going off mute, so I'll kick it over to her next. You know, I think I mentioned in the opening remarks, we need the government to intervene, and I believe that's critically important. We also need Facebook to step up. So I'll quickly say what I think Facebook needs to do right away, even though they're not going to listen, and then I'll say what I think the government needs to do. One of the things Frances Haugen revealed is that that I think we knew a little bit about, but we learned more about this week, was that the safeguards that Facebook put in place the week of the election last year, that they flicked off once the election was over, could easily be in place now, right? What they did that week was they put a little, what they call friction on posts. So you might have to click through a link before you could share it, or there's some sort of warning. It just makes people take a pause, take a breath, and think about what they're doing before they do it. So they could easily flick that switch back on. They had that on because even Facebook realized that the rhetoric was getting really hot, and that the likelihood of violence based on engagement on Facebook was high. They need to put that back on right away. They need to figure that out. If it were me, and I knew, like, for instance, the UN found that my platform played a contributing role in genocide in Myanmar, or as the documents revealed, I was responsible, and even in part, for the rise of authoritarianism in Brazil, in the Philippines, in India, and many other places. You know, Heidi's done a ton of research on this. I couldn't put my head on my pillow at night. I'd shut it down before I let it go on without figuring out how to mitigate. So there's immediate things that Facebook could do. Boot off the white supremacists, adopt the change the terms model policies. We have a set of model policies that I think are really good. Invest, you know, significantly expand investment in content moderators, and do that across languages, right? Another thing that Haugen revealed is that only 10 to 20% of hate speech could possibly be caught by AI. And we've been saying this at Change the Terms. We need individual humans who are able to pick up on dog whistles and contextual clues and are familiar with the cultural nuances of a given geographic region. And we need those people to be hired. So that's what Facebook ought to do right away. And they have the resources, they have the tech available. They're just choosing not to use it. But because they won't, or they won't do it at scale and the type of scale needed to mitigate the harms we've been discussing here, the government needs to step in right away. And I've been beating a dead horse here about the data, because I think it's really important part of the recipe that helps them bake up all these lies and conspiracy theories. The targeted nature of hate and disinformation needs to be addressed. US Congress needs to pass data privacy and civil rights law, a comprehensive law that limits our data collection, the data collection they do on us, that prohibits algorithmic discrimination, and that provides for much greater transparency about how these companies operate. The Federal Trade Commission is well positioned to take up these issues right away, particularly around how our data is collected and whether our data is being collected and used in ways that are abusive or unfair. So that body, which isn't, we have at least 3 more years with a Biden administration FTC. They need to take this up right away. We don't know what's going to happen in the midterms in Congress next year, but we do know that we have some really excellent experts. Lena Khan, Alvaro Bedoya has been nominated to serve on the Federal Trade Commission. He's brilliant about privacy and data issues. And Becca Kelly Slaughter is already sitting there. Is just like an incredible expert. So FTC needs to act right away. I think, I could talk about the policy stuff all day, but I'll just say too, I think we really need to look at the ecosystem of how hate and disinformation have gone so mainstream, how they've become profitable. And we have to recognize that what social media has done and Facebook has done in part is fill a gap in information, quality news and information that we're lacking here in the United States, because we've lost over 50% of local journalists in the past 12 years. And so we need to look at this systematically. And one thing we're proposing is a 2% tax on all online advertising, and that those funds be redistributed to public media. And I'm not talking your grandma's NPR. I'm talking about developing a new system where we're infusing cash into local journalists that are covering Black, Latinx, Asian American, and not just covering, that are run by people of color, so that we can get the information that we want and need and figure out how to filter out all this fluff and nonsense.
Well, I'm not going to be able to do any more than all the stuff that you just said, Jessica, which is absolutely right. I'll just add a couple little things. I think the government is going to have to act to make it possible for us to get access to the data, researchers to get access to the data in a protected manner, right? So that people's identities aren't disclosed, so that somebody outside of Facebook can figure out what's going on inside of Facebook. I think the era of social media companies in general being able to keep their research to themselves has got to end, because the harms are just so massive. So I think that's one of the solutions here. We have to get into the black box of Facebook. Just a couple other little tiny things. Facebook is operating in some places in very volatile societies where it has no content moderation, no cultural context, no expertise. Those are the kinds of places where you see things happening like what happened in Myanmar with the Rohingya genocide. But there are many other places where mass killings have happened. I would suggest that perhaps Facebook should not be doing business in places where it can't come in with the appropriate resources to protect those people, including something that they do not have, which is genocide protocols, systems to go beyond, like the friction you mentioned, Jessica, for when things are becoming really, really volatile. And this is just a thing that, it doesn't get much attention because people don't think a lot about outside of the United States or outside of the European Union. And yet this is where the harms are so terrible. I don't know what can be done about Zuckerberg's control of this company. I mean, the thing is that Facebook's, basically helping to build authoritarian systems everywhere is modeled in those buildings back on Hacker Way up in Northern California, right? It's a one-man game with one guy where the buck stops, who has a lot of power over what happens to about 3 billion people. And so, the FTC is really important. Civil rights protections, privacy protections, all of these things. But something has to be done about that, because imagine if he had some shareholder pressure. Imagine if he had a board that was diverse, like Brenda is saying, and could bring up these issues in a systematic way to make the company have to address them. It would just be a different environment. And I think it's what makes Facebook able to be so blasé. I don't know how they sleep at night being involved in things like genocide, but they're far more blasé about these issues and non-compliant and lying, basically, I think, than some of the other companies. It's quite extraordinary.
I think another thing, if I can jump in, I'm reminded of the tobacco campaigns, and they didn't get traction until they looked at kids. And one of the things that came out now is kids and Instagram. And you have just such a polarization and a logjam in Congress, which is why my fellow panelists have been talking a lot about executive action and campaigns, because you've had a sort of paralysis where, everybody hates big tech, and the Republicans say, frankly, without evidence, that there's a huge conservative bias. And the Democrats, go on about hate, and so they hate them, but they can't come to together on anything bipartisan, which is still needed. So one, I hope that Frances Haugen talking about amplification may shake that free. But two, I think, as was the case in the tobacco campaigns, kids and the harm that's being done to kids, like we're looking at maybe a wedge that can finally move Congress. But otherwise, I think we have to look at other things. We also have to look at the states. There is a transparency bill that the California state legislature is going to take up in its upcoming term that would require, it's California Assembly Bill 587 on social media transparency. And it would require consistent and comprehensive transparency about platform terms of services and content moderation practices, with details and metrics that would allow comparisons and show progress in a meaningful way. Because right now, these so-called transparency reports that Facebook and others tout have a couple of metrics. As Heidi and others have said, you never know if they're true. You can't compare them from report to report. You don't know what the context is. When they say we have actioned 97% of the hate that we action is stuff we found without being reported. But maybe that's, as Frances Haugen has said, 3% of the hate that's really there. They're never telling you the metrics that we really need. And they're never letting anybody independent in when someone gets too close, like Laura Edelson did from NYU and her colleagues, they throw them off. So I think that's very telling. And I think there's going to be a multifaceted campaign where we look at the executive and the federal government, but we also look at the states. I am also, Heidi, so worried and thinking about, and Brenda, as you said, in a lot of other campaigns that have multifaceted, you had an investor, a shareholder, corporate campaign, and it's hard. I am not sure how you do that when you've got somebody who doesn't have to listen to folks that have gazillions of dollars in investment in Facebook, but don't have the voting power. You can't even have a proxy, hullabaloo at a meeting because, Mark Zuckerberg controls who can even talk, period. One guy controls the biggest, least accountable media and publishing organization this world has ever known.
And shareholders have tried, right? I mean, every year at their annual meeting, shareholders introduce resolutions on these things, but they don't pass because of what you name here, Eileen. He's the emperor.
Well, you have to say, if it's a public company, there's, under the law, there's nothing public about this thing, right? It's fully controlled by one private individual. It's insane.
If I could jump in really quickly, because I would have two other sort of policy suggestions to kind of tack on to the other great menu of options that we were already given. I would say that, again, going to this issue of, how deeply partisan and polarizing the issue of legislating and regulating big tech is, I think it's important to remember that we have existing civil rights laws that could protect against some of the harms that do grow out of sort of algorithmic amplification and targeted advertising and so on and so forth. So I think that it's also really important to make sure that that various agencies who do have civil rights powers and authorities are making sure that they're zeroing in and including some sort of strategy around online harms, civil rights harms and abuses. So I think that's one thing that can be done, right now in the immediate term. Another sort of policy option that I think would specifically go to better securing the Latino community is sort of one that's more holistic in nature. And that is actually addressing the unique vulnerabilities that do make Latinos somewhat easier to target and more susceptible to mass scale misinformation campaigns. And a big one there is really closing the digital divide. Latinos are overrepresented in the digital divide. Brenda, I know NHMC is, one of the leaders in this space. And the reality is that the more that we're disconnected, the lower rates of digital literacy skills that Latinos are going to be able to have. And if you don't have adequate digital literacy skills, it becomes harder to navigate these platforms. It becomes harder to spot and identify misinformation or fake news. It becomes harder to be able to fact check a post that you see or content that you come across. So again, I think I put forth this sort of policy proposal and tie it to this issue because again, this isn't going away. Big tech, if we know anything about technology, it's that it will continue at rapid pace and where there's no putting it back in Pandora's box. So if we really want to make sure that we're keeping Latinos in particular safe online, we also need to make sure that we're adequately equipping them with the skills in which to navigate these platforms and really kind of better understand what the rights that they do have to their data. And again, ways in which they can engage online, both with each other, but then also with accurate information and news sources.
We're coming to an end. I just wanted to ask Jacobo, did you have any other solutions?
No, I mean, I think everyone kind of said a lot here and there's a lot of solutions and recommendations. I couldn't agree more. I think obviously from Facebook, we need more transparency, and from the government, we need more oversight and regulations.
Well, on behalf of the National Hispanic Media Coalition, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to today's panelists, Jessica, Heidi, Eileen, Jacobo, Claudia, for your wisdom and this enlightening conversation. This is an ongoing issue that we must address not only with Facebook, but other social media platforms. For more than a decade, NHMC has been warning about the dangers and harm and the lack of Spanish language content moderation on platforms is causing to the Latino community. NHMC continues to help lead, co-found, and collaborate with advocacy coalition groups such as Change the Term, Stop Hate for Profit, Ya Basta Facebook, and the Spanish Language Disinformation Coalition that is made up, all you are members, and is made up of 20+ organizations, Latino and non-Latino organizations, to address hate speech, disinformation, and other harmful content prior to Ms. Hogan's testimony. And we will continue to do so for the safety of the Latino community, for our children, and for the democracy of the United States of America. With the public's help, NHMC will continue to fight for social justice, protecting consumers, and demanding for platform accountability. So we urge the public to demand policy reforms from their legislators to protect our communities from the harms these social media platforms exploit for their financial gain. You can start today by signing our petition to urge Congress to regulate social media platforms. Each and every one of us can demand change. So please visit the link below. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you.